The old golden retriever, Max, had always been more than just a pet. He was the silent guardian of the Carter family. But one stormy night, his relentless barking led to a revelation that would change their lives forever. The rain lashed against the windows of the old Thompson house, filling the air with the rhythmic sound of water drumming against glass. Lightning split the sky, casting eerie shadows across the living room walls, where 12-year-old Ethan Thompson sat curled up on the couch, flipping through the pages of his favorite mystery novel. His golden retriever, Max, lay at his feet, his large amber eyes fixed on the study door. Ethan scratched behind Max's ears absent-mindedly. "What's up, buddy?" he murmured. Max let out a low whimper, his tail flicking nervously against the wooden floor. David Thompson, Ethan's father, glanced up from his laptop at the dining table. "Max has been acting strange lately," he commented. "Scratching the floor in the study, staring at walls. Almost like he sees something we don't." Ethan's mother, Laura, sighed as she carried in a tray of cocoa mugs. "Probably mice," she said, handing a cup to Ethan. "This house is old. Wouldn't be the first time we've had uninvited guests." Ethan didn't think it was mice. Max had never behaved this way before, not with this urgency, this restless insistence. It was as if the dog was trying to tell them something. Just then, a loud clap of thunder rattled the house, making the lights flicker. Max sprang to his feet and bolted toward the study, barking furiously. "Max," Ethan jumped up, nearly spilling his cocoa. He hurried after his dog, his heart pounding. By the time Ethan reached the study, Max was already there, his claws scraping frantically at a particular spot on the wooden floor near the old desk. The dog whined, then looked back at Ethan as if pleading for him to do something. Ethan knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" He ran his fingers over the floorboards, but they felt solid. No gaps, no cracks, just aged wood. David and Laura appeared in the doorway, frowning. "Not again," David muttered, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, get him out of there." "Dad, what if he's trying to?" "Ethan," his mother's tone was gentle but firm. "It's late. We'll check it in the morning, okay?" Ethan hesitated. Something inside him told him that whatever was under that floor was important, but he could tell his parents weren't in the mood to indulge his curiosity. With a sigh, he wrapped his arms around Max's neck and pulled him back. The golden retriever resisted for a moment, then let out a reluctant huff and followed Ethan back to the couch. As the storm raged on outside, Max lay beside him, still staring toward the study. His body was tense, ears perked up. Ethan ran his fingers through Max's thick fur. "We'll figure it out, boy," he whispered. "I promise." But deep down, he had no idea that Max had just uncovered the first piece of a long-buried family secret. Ethan woke up before dawn, the memory of the previous night still fresh in his mind. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick morning fog that curled around the trees outside the Thompson house. But inside, everything was quiet except for the soft tapping sound coming from the study. Ethan sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. He knew that sound. Max. He slipped out of bed and padded quietly down the hallway. Sure enough, there was Max, his large golden paws scraping at the same exact spot on the study floor where he had been scratching the night before. Ethan crouched beside him. "You're really fixated on this, huh?" he murmured, placing a hand on Max's back. The dog turned to him, eyes bright and insistent, then whined a sound Ethan rarely heard from him. It wasn't fear. It was urgency. Ethan ran his hands over the floorboards again, pressing down, knocking softly. Was Max smelling something underneath? The idea sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "What if there's something under here?" he whispered. Before he could investigate further, a voice interrupted him. "Ethan." He jumped, spinning around to see his father standing in the doorway, arms crossed. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Not this again. The dog's just being weird. He's old." Ethan frowned. "What if he's not just being weird? What if there's something down there?" David chuckled dryly. "You think there's treasure buried under the floor or something?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't know what he expected to find, but the way Max was acting, it wasn't normal. "I don't know," he admitted. "But shouldn't we at least check?" David's expression darkened for a fraction of a second so quickly that Ethan almost missed it. Then, shaking his head, He ruffled Ethan's hair and said, "There's nothing there, kiddo. Let it go." But Ethan saw it. The way his father's jaw tightened, the flicker of something, maybe fear, in his eyes. Max barked suddenly, making both of them jump. He pawed at the floor with renewed determination, whining louder this time. David exhaled sharply. "That's enough," he said, a little too firmly. "Come on, let's go have breakfast." Reluctantly, Ethan followed his father out of the study. But as he sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly poking at his scrambled eggs, he couldn't stop thinking about the look on his father's face. There was something he wasn't telling him. So that night, when everyone was asleep, Ethan was going to find out what it was. The house was quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The moon cast silver streaks through the windows, illuminating the wooden floors in an eerie glow. Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzing with questions. Max's behavior, his father's reaction, it all felt connected, and there was only one way to get answers. Carefully, he slid out of bed, making sure not to wake his parents. Max, curled up at the foot of the bed, lifted his head as if he already knew what Ethan was about to do. "Come on, boy," Ethan whispered. Max hopped down silently, his tail wagging. Together they crept through the dark hallway and into the study. The moment they reached the wooden floor near the desk, Max started scratching again, more urgently this time. Ethan knelt down and ran his fingers along the floorboards, pressed his palm against them, testing for movement. Nothing. "Come on," he muttered. Max let out a soft whine and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. That's when Ethan noticed a faint seam between the planks. His heart pounded as he traced the outline with his fingers. He pressed down on one corner, and to his shock, the wood shifted slightly beneath his touch. It was loose. Swallowing hard, Ethan dug his nails under the edge and carefully pried up the wooden plank. It came away with a soft creak, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath the floor. Max sniffed the hole eagerly, his tail wagging. Ethan reached inside, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, a rusted old metal box. What? His breath caught in his throat. He glanced at Max, who was staring at him expectantly, as if saying, "Open it." With trembling hands, Ethan unlatched the rusted lock. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing its mysterious contents. A stack of old yellowed letters, a small, ornate key, a faded black and white photograph of a man Ethan didn't recognize. He turned the photo over. There was a name written on the back in elegant cursive. Jonathan T. Ethan's hands shook slightly. Who was Jonathan T? And why had his picture and letters been hidden under the floor? Before he could think any further, he heard a soft creak from the hallway. Someone was awake. Heart racing, Ethan hurriedly shut the box, placed the floorboard back in place, and grabbed Max's collar. They slipped out of the study just as footsteps reached the doorway. Ethan didn't dare look back. Ethan barely slept. The moment he was back in his room, he stuffed the rusted metal box under his bed and climbed beneath the covers, heart still pounding. His mind raced with questions. Who was Jonathan T? Why were his photo letters and a key hidden under the floor? And why had his father reacted so strangely when Ethan suggested checking? Max, curled up beside him, let out a soft sigh, as if satisfied they had taken the first step toward the truth. Morning arrived sooner than Ethan expected. Sunlight streamed through the curtains and downstairs. The sound of clinking plates and his mother humming signaled that breakfast was being made. Ethan sat up and immediately reached for the box. He carefully lifted the lid again, studying the contents in daylight. The photograph of Jonathan T. was old black and white, slightly curled at the edges. The man in the picture wore a serious expression, dressed in a neat suit and hat, standing in front of what looked like this very house. Ethan's fingers brushed over the letters beneath it. The paper was fragile, the ink faded but still legible. He carefully unfolded one and read aloud, "Dearest Jonathan, I don't trust him. I know what he's capable of. You must be careful if he finds out. You'll lose everything. Please don't let him take what's rightfully yours. Forever watching. C." Ethan's breath hitched. Lose everything? Take what's his. Max, sensing his excitement, let out a soft bark. Ethan quickly refolded the letter and stuffed everything back in the box. He needed answers. Ethan studied his father carefully. David was sipping his coffee, flipping through a newspaper, looking like any other normal morning, but Ethan knew better now. Ethan took a deep breath. "Hey, Dad," he said casually. "Does the name Jonathan T mean anything to you?" David's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. For a moment, a shadow flickered across his face, just like last night. "No," David said too quickly. "Why?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to reveal what he had found not yet. "I just saw the name written somewhere," he said carefully. "Thought maybe he was a relative." David set his cup down. "We don't have anyone by that name in the family," he said firmly. "Where did you see it?" Ethan shrugged. "Just in some old stuff lying around?" His father's expression didn't relax. In fact, if anything, he looked more tense. "Forget about it," David muttered, turning back to his paper. But Ethan couldn't forget, not when he had proof in his room. Not when Max had led him to something that clearly his father didn't want him to find. Ethan sat in the living room pretending to watch TV while secretly studying the key he had found in the box. It was small, silver, and slightly tarnished. It had to open something, but what? Max, who had been lying by Ethan's feet, suddenly stood up and padded toward the hallway. Ethan watched as Max stopped near the attic door. The golden retriever stared at it, then barked once and sat down. Ethan's stomach flipped. He had never been inside the attic before. His parents always kept it locked, saying there was nothing up there but dusty old furniture and junk. But what if that wasn't true? What if Max was telling him exactly where to look next? Ethan reached into his pocket and clutched the key. He was about to find out. Ethan stood in front of the attic door, heart pounding. The silver key in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. Was this really the right key? Was this what Max had been trying to lead him to? Max sat patiently beside him, wagging his tail in encouragement. Ethan took a deep breath, reached out, and tried the key in the lock. Click. The door unlocked. What? He had expected resistance. Maybe the key wouldn't fit. Maybe it was for something else. But the way it turned so smoothly made him feel like it was meant to be found. Slowly, Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a dark, dust-filled space. The attic smelled like old wood, forgotten memories, and something else, something unfamiliar, yet strangely important. He stepped inside, flicking on his phone's flashlight. Boxes, trunks, old furniture, covered in white sheets. Years of untouched history. Max walked in confidently, sniffing around as if searching for something specific. "What now, boy?" Ethan whispered. Max padded toward a locked cabinet tucked in the corner. It was an antique wooden chest, its surface worn and scratched. Ethan hesitated, then knelt beside it, feeling the cool metal of the lock. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and fitted into the lock. Turned. The chest creaked open, revealing its hidden contents. Ethan's eyes widened. Inside were more old letters bound together with twine, dozens of them. Shaking slightly, he picked one up and unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "Jonathan, I fear that if you don't act soon, everything will be taken from you. You were meant to inherit this home, but I overheard him talking last night. He plans to change everything. He's lying to you. Please, you must fight for what is yours before it's too late. See." Ethan's fingers trembled. This wasn't just a collection of letters, this was evidence. Jonathan T. had been wronged. Someone had stolen what was meant to be his, and that someone had to be one of Ethan's ancestors. Max let out a soft bark, drawing Ethan's attention back to the chest. Inside, beneath the letters, was an old, leather-bound journal. The cover had one name embossed in gold lettering: Jonathan Thompson. Ethan's blood ran cold. Jonathan wasn't just some stranger, he was family. Ethan's hands trembled as he lifted the old leather-bound journal from the chest. The name on the cover, Jonathan Thompson, confirmed what he had feared. This wasn't just some long-lost stranger. Jonathan was part of their family. Max wagged his tail, his golden fur glowing in the dim attic light. He sat attentively watching Ethan, as if he already knew what the journal contained. Ethan took a deep breath, sat cross-legged on the dusty wooden floor, and slowly opened the book. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but the words were still readable. Descriptions of the house, mentions of the Thompson family's farmland. But as Ethan flipped through the pages, the tone changed. Jonathan's handwriting grew shaky and rushed. His words became urgent. I no longer trust him. He says I have no claim to this house, that I have no right to what was promised to me, but I have the documents to prove it. I know what he's trying to do. He wants me gone. But I won't let him steal what is mine. Ethan swallowed hard. Who was Jonathan talking about? He turned a few more pages. It is worse than I thought. He has already changed the will. My inheritance is gone. I am nothing in his eyes now. No one will believe me. If I do not act soon, I will lose everything. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. Someone in his family had changed the will. Someone had taken Jonathan's inheritance and erased him from history. Jonathan had been betrayed. In the Atisathan's fingers tightened around the book. He needed to show this to his dad now. He needed to understand it first. Who had stolen from Jonathan? And what had happened to him? Before he could turn another page, a floorboard creaked behind him. Ethan froze. Slowly, he turned his head toward the attic door. His father stood in the doorway. David's eyes weren't angry, but they weren't calm either. They were troubled. What are you doing up here? David asked, his voice quiet. Ethan hesitated, but he could feel the weight of the journal in his hands. He couldn't hide it now. Dad, he swallowed. Who was Jonathan Thompson? His father's face paled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then David exhaled slowly and walked into the attic, lowering himself onto an old trunk. He ran a hand over his face, looking tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of holding something in. I was hoping you'd never ask, David finally said. But I guess it's time you knew the truth. Max let out a small whine and rested his head on Ethan's lap, as if saying, it's okay. Keep going. And Ethan listened as his father prepared to reveal a family secret buried for generations. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The attic felt colder, the air heavy with unspoken words. His father sat on the old trunk, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the wooden floor. For the first time in his life, Ethan saw something in his father's eyes that he had never noticed before: guilt. Max lay beside Ethan, his golden fur warm against Ethan's leg. His eyes fixed on David, as if waiting for him to finally tell the truth. David exhaled slowly. Jonathan Thompson was my great-granduncle. He was the rightful heir to this house. Ethan's breath caught. Then why don't we know about him? David hesitated, because someone erased him from the family records. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He gripped the old journal tighter. Who? His father sighed. My great-grandfather, Charles Thompson. Ethan's mind raced. See, he whispered. The letter someone was warning Jonathan about him. David nodded grimly. Yes, Jonathan and Charles were brothers. But Charles, he was greedy. When their father passed away, he changed the will to make himself the sole inheritor of the house and land. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. That's stealing. Yes. David's voice was heavy. Jonathan tried to fight it. He had proofed the original will, the letters, everything. But Charles had more influence, more money, more power. He convinced the town that Jonathan was unstable, that he was making false accusations. Ethan felt sick. What happened to him? David looked away. No one knows. One day, Jonathan just disappeared. No records, no sightings. It was as if he had never existed. Silence filled the attic. Ethan's fingers ran over the leather cover of Jonathan's journal. Jonathan hadn't vanished. He had been erased. His mind reeled. And you knew about this? David's shoulders slumped. I found out years ago. My grandfather, your great-grandfather, told me the truth before he passed. He said it was the family's greatest shame. That's why I never spoke about it. Ethan stared at him. You were going to let Jonathan be forgotten? David flinched at the accusation. I didn't know what to do. The past is the past, Ethan. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Max let out a low growl. It mattered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Well, it matters now. He stood up, gripping Jonathan's journal. This wasn't just history. This was about justice. It's about making things right. Jonathan had fought for the truth. And Ethan wasn't going to let his story end in silence. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he gripped Jonathan's journal. The weight of his family's past pressed down on him. But instead of fear, he felt something stronger: determination. Max sat beside him, ears perked, sensing the shift in the room. His golden eyes flicked between Ethan and David as if waiting to see what they would do next. Ethan squared his shoulders. "We have to tell people," David sighed heavily. "And say what, Ethan?" "That our ancestor was a thief. That our whole family history is built on a lie." "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation, "because it's the truth." David ran a hand through his hair. "I get it, kid. You want justice? But this happened over 100 years ago. There's nothing we can do now." Ethan slammed the journal shut. "That's not true." He pointed at the old letters in the chest. "We have proof. The real will might still exist. Jonathan fought for his rights. He shouldn't be forgotten just because it's inconvenient for us." David hesitated. "Even if we prove Jonathan was the rightful heir, what then? The house is still ours. The land is still in our name." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "But it shouldn't be." The words hung in the air. David's expression hardened. "Are you saying we should just give everything up?" Ethan exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I'm saying we should make it right. Maybe Jonathan had family descendants who don't even know this place was supposed to be theirs. Don't we owe them something?" David rubbed his temples. "Even if we found them, what do you expect us to do? Just hand them the house?" Ethan didn't know. But he knew one thing for sure. Staying silent was not an option. Max let out a bark, breaking the tension. He padded toward the chest and nudged something buried beneath the letters. Ethan frowned and reached inside, pulling out a second envelope thicker than the others. His heart pounded as he unfolded the brittle pages inside. At the top, in faded ink, were the words, "Last Will and Testament of Henry Thompson." Ethan's breath hitched. "Dad." He turned the page toward him. "This is the real will." David's face drained of color. The document clearly stated that the house and land were meant to go to Jonathan Thompson, not Charles. Jonathan, everything his great-grandfather.
I told him.
The family had been told for generations was a lie. This changes everything. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it does." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The attic, filled with dust and secrets, seemed to hold its breath. Finally, David sighed. "We need to do some research. If Jonathan had family, they deserved to know the truth." Ethan's chest swelled with relief. His father wasn't dismissing it anymore. He was listening. Max barked happily, wagging his tail. Ethan reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "You led us right to it." David let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I can't believe it. The dog knew before we did." Ethan grinned. "Guess Max isn't just a pet. He's part of the family's history, too." David exhaled. "All right, kid. Let's set the record straight. For Jonathan. For the truth. For justice." Ethan sat at the dining table. The reel was spread out in front of him. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. This house was never meant to belong to Charles. Max lay at his feet, tail flicking lazily, as if he knew his job wasn't done yet. David sat across from Ethan, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "If Jonathan had family, they'd be his direct descendants," he muttered. "But we don't even know if he ever had kids." Ethan chewed his lip. "There has to be something, a record, a name. Can't just let this go." David sighed. "All right, start with old census records." He typed in Jonathan Thompson, early 1900s, birth and family records. A long list of archived documents appeared. Ethan leaned forward, eyes scanning the results. There. He pointed to a faded document labeled Jonathan Thompson's census record. David clicked on it, and the page loaded slowly. Ethan held his breath. The record showed Jonathan living in this very house in 1901, but something at the bottom caught Ethan's eye. "Wait, look," he pointed. "He lived here, but someone else was listed in the household." A name stood out beneath Jonathan's. Eleanor Thompson, daughter, age 3. Ethan's jaw dropped. Jonathan had a daughter. David blinked. "Which means he has descendants." Excitement surged through Ethan. Jonathan's bloodline hadn't disappeared. Someone out there was meant to inherit this house, this land, their legacy. But where was Eleanor now? If Eleanor was 3 in 1901, she was born around 1898. Let's check birth records. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, gripping Jonathan's journal as his dad drove down the quiet streets of their small town. Max sat in the back seat, ears perked, tail wagging as if he knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. Max sat in the back seat, ears perked, tail wagging as if he knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. David glanced at Ethan. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan nodded firmly. "Jonathan's family deserves to know the truth." David sighed but didn't argue. He turned onto a narrow street lined with modest houses. A few seconds later, they pulled up in front of a small white house with a blue door. A mailbox at the edge of the driveway read, "Daniel Lawson." Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. It's the last piece of the mystery. He stepped out of the car, Max following close behind. His dad knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, footsteps sounded from inside. The door opened, revealing a man in his late 60s with graying hair and kind, tired eyes. Daniel Lawson. He frowned slightly, glancing between David and Ethan. "Can I help you?" David cleared his throat. "Mr. Lawson, I know this is going to sound strange, but we believe we've discovered something about your family. Something important." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "My family." Ethan stepped forward, holding out the journal. "Your great-grandfather, Jonathan Thompson, he was supposed to inherit our house, but someone stole it from him." Daniel's eyes widened. His gaze flicked to the worn leather book in Ethan's hands, then back to his face. "Come inside," he said quietly. The space was warm, filled with old photographs and bookshelves. Ethan and his dad sat on the couch while Daniel settled into a chair. Max lay at Ethan's feet, silent but alert. Out. Daniel picked up the journal, running his fingers over the name on the cover. "Jonathan Thompson," he murmured. "My great-grandfather." Ethan nodded. "We found letters, too, and the original will." Daniel's head snapped up. The will. David pulled the fragile document from a folder. It proves that Jonathan was supposed to inherit the Thompson house, but his brother Charles changed everything. Next, Jonathan was erased from history. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he took the document, his eyes scanning the words. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Daniel let out a soft breath. "I always wondered," he whispered. "My grandmother Eleanor Shea never talked about her father. She used to say our family had a home once, but we lost it. I thought it was just a story." He shook his head. "But it wasn't. It was stolen from us." Ethan swallowed. "We wanted you to know, to set the record straight." Ardagno looked up, his expression unreadable. "And what do you plan to do about it?" "What?" David hesitated. "Legally, the house is still ours. But if you wanted to make a claim, you'd have every right to." Daniel was quiet for a long time, and he smiled, a small knowing smile. "I don't need the house," he said. "It's been your family's for generations now, but knowing the truth, that means everything." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Daniel chuckled. My grandmother always believed that loyalty and truth mattered more than anything. I think she'd be proud of what you've done." Ethan grinned. "I think Jonathan would be too." Max let out a soft bark, his tail wagging, as if saying, "Good job. You did it." Ethan sat back in his chair, watching as Daniel carefully turned the pages of Jonathan's journal. The older man's fingers traced the faded ink, his expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. "It's strange," Daniel murmured. "I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And now, all of a sudden, I have a connection to a man who fought for something he never got to see." Ethan nodded. "But now, at least we can make sure his story isn't forgotten." David leaned forward. "There's one more thing we wanted to ask you." Daniel looked up, his gray eyes curious. David hesitated, then continued. "Since you're the closest living relative to Jonathan, we're wondering if you'd be willing to let us officially recognize him as the rightful heir. Put his name back in the records. acknowledged that this was his home, even if history tried to erase him. Ethan held his breath, waiting. For a moment Daniel was silent, and slowly he smiled. That, he said, would mean the world to me. Ethan and his dad worked tirelessly to bring Jonathan's name back into history. They contacted the town's historical society, submitted the original will, and even published Jonathan's journal as a historical record. At first, some people doubted the story, but once they saw the real documents, the truth became undeniable. Soon, local newspapers picked up the story. Family discovers hidden will. Proves house was stolen generations ago. The town hall agreed to amend their records, officially listing Jonathan Thompson as the rightful heir to the house. And in a final, fitting tribute, they commissioned a plaque to be placed outside the home. The Thompson house, built in 1895, originally meant to belong to Jonathan Thompson, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way home. When the plaque was finally installed, Ethan stood beside Daniel, staring at the words. Max sat at his feet, tail wagging. Daniel let out a deep breath. He's finally home, Ethan smiled. Yeah, he is. Back at the house, Ethan sat on the porch, looking up at the stars. Max lay beside him, his warm body pressed against Ethan's leg. David stepped outside, a mug of coffee in hand. You did a good thing, kid. Ethan glanced at his dad. We did a good thing. David smiled, nodding. For the first time in a long time, their home felt different. Not haunted by secrets, not weighed down by lies, but filled with truth. Ethan reached down, scratching Max behind his ears. Couldn't have done it without you, buddy. Max let out a soft, content huff, closing his eyes. Ethan leaned back, staring at the sky, knowing that somewhere out there, Jonathan was finally at peace. And all because a loyal dog refused to let the past stay buried.